Okay, well, it's 12:05. Welcome, everybody. This is the UCCS Speaker Series, and it's the final talk of this season, continuing with our 2021-22 theme of emerging from the pandemic, promoting health and prosperity for all Californians. For those of you who are regulars, please note that the UCCS Speaker Series will be taking a summer break as we'll be busy moving back to 1130 K Street, which is our former headquarters, where we hope to be having hybrid and in-person programming starting in late September. So we look forward to having you join us for that. But when it comes to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, there's been very few positive developments, but there are a few glowing exceptions. One is the rapid development of vaccines that have succeeded in keeping many people alive and out of the hospital. Another is the infusion of federal monies that have given people who would otherwise be uninsured access to Medicaid and other forms of health insurance. And the third positive development, in my view, is that the health system as a whole has been forced to respond to the crisis in ways that might ultimately improve both pandemic and post-pandemic care. At my hospital, for example, UC Davis Health, the use of video visits has absolutely exploded, and that's increased access and convenience for patients in ways that will very likely be difficult to reverse. And this is just one way in which healthcare is being digitally transformed. So here to talk about these developments and more is Dr. Robert Wachter. It's a real privilege to welcome Dr. Wachter here today, as he's not only a longtime thought leader in medicine, but increasingly through his tweets and work with the media, a trusted source of information on COVID and other public health issues. He's one of the founders of the hospitalist movement, a leader in the patient safety movement, and the author of 4 books, including The Digital Doctor, Hope, Hype, and Harm in the Dawn of Medicine's Computer Age. He's won numerous awards for his work, and his 250,000 Twitter followers have viewed his tweets over 400 million times. Oh, and in between, he chairs one of the foremost departments of internal medicine in the country at UC San Francisco. So just a word about questions before we launch into Dr. Wachter's talk. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A section of Zoom, Q&A button on Zoom. But do be sure to leave your name and affiliation so that we can connect you to whoever you are and wherever you work. You can also ask questions live at the end of the talk. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Wachter. Bob.
Thanks, Richard. Real pleasure to be here and be with all of you. As usual, sorry it's virtual, but such is our life. And I agree with your intro. I think that obviously the last 2.5 years have been extraordinarily painful and tragic in many ways, but they have also been a stimulus for some real transformations in the healthcare system. And that's what I'm going to try to focus on today. So let me start out with something foundational. This is a group of UCSF medical students. A few years ago, I was talking to them, and they're like, they're so enthusiastic and forward-thinking and innovative, and they just, as I was talking to them, they just seem too upbeat. Because I have 900 faculty members that work in my department, and I can't say that every single one of them is ecstatic every day. There are often things that they complain about. And so I'm not sure why I was in this mood, but I said, I got to take these students sort of down to earth and help them understand the world they're going into. And so I said, you folks should really understand that you are entering a profession totally unlike the one I entered 30 years ago, in which you'll be under immense pressure, unremitting pressure to deliver the highest quality, safest, most accessible, most equitable, most satisfying care at the lowest possible cost. I was really trying to shake them up. And one of the students raised his hand and said to me, what exactly were you trying to do? Which I thought was a question that was incredibly profound and really gives us all pause to think about what is the goal of our system, and the fact that we are now under more and more pressure to figure out how to make it better, safer, more equitable, and less expensive is exactly what we should have been doing all along. My sort of premise in a lot of what I do is that digital will be an absolutely essential part of that transformation. although it's not easy. And there will be and have already been a number of speed bumps along the way. And so my talk today is really about that transformation, but with a particular emphasis on how COVID has changed the path and to in many extents, accelerated it faster than it would have was happening on its own. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. A few thoughts on the pandemic. I want to spend a little bit of time sort of doing some big picture stuff on the pandemic because I think they relate to very big issues about transformation in healthcare and more generally in society. Talk a little bit about tech and things that were accelerated by COVID. Richard also already mentioned telemedicine. I'm going to talk about something a little less sexy, dashboards, and a couple of things that I thought might have hit their tipping point, but to me didn't. Talk about where we are in digital transformation and what I think of as the post-electronic health record era. Doesn't mean we're all ditching our electronic health records, which we spend hundreds of millions of dollars on and have become absolutely foundational to our day-to-day work, but why the future of transformation will not depend solely on this huge enterprise-wide, fairly monolithic tool, but be much more diverse and I think much more interesting. And then talk a little bit about the future of healthcare's digital transformation. So given the audience, I need to spend a minute or two on politics. And this is not a particularly partisan comment, but I do think it's relevant to as we, I no longer say come out of the pandemic, because I think we're going to be in a version of where we are now for the next several years. But as we think about the current stage we're at the pandemic, I think it is worth reflecting on America's response to it and learning what we can from that. And I hearken back to something the journalist Ed Young, who won the Pulitzer last year as a journalist for The Atlantic and writes brilliantly about COVID and society. This is something Ed wrote in the very earliest days of the pandemic. And I've added some portions that he didn't talk about at the time because they weren't issues at the time. But in March 2020, remember that, Ed wrote, aspects of America's identity may need rethinking after COVID. Many of the country's values have seemed to work against it during the pandemic. It's individualism, exceptionalism, and tendency to equate doing whatever you want with an act of resistance meant that when it came time to save lives and stay indoors and then later wear masks and get vaccinated, some people flocked to bars and clubs and later didn't wear masks and didn't get vaccinated. Having internalized years of anti-terrorism messaging following 9/11, Americans resolved not to live in fear. But SARS-CoV-2 has no interest in their terror, only in their cells. I think that's really kind of a smart way of framing the challenge of our political response in the way America sort of is organized and how people think about their lives. Now, just spend a minute on the endgame. And as I've already implied, I think I'm not sure there will be an endgame if by that we mean this goes away. I tend to think of COVID more like the painting of the Golden Gate Bridge. And as you probably know, the Golden Gate Bridge has to get painted and it takes about 5 years to paint the whole thing. And then as soon as they're done, they have to start all over again because obviously it's 5 years have gone by and there's a lot of weather out there. And so the protection fades. And that's kind of the way I think about COVID, that if you think about where we are now, we're probably at about 90% population immunity. If by that you accept immunity either through vaccination or through prior infection. You may have seen a recent CDC study that said that 60% of the population has had prior infection. When you combine that with the folks that have been immunized, you get up to probably more than 90% of people have some immunity one way or another, immunity that they did not have in March 2020. The problem is that we have new variants that we've seen are pretty good at resisting the immunity, and also the immunity fades, both from vaccination and from natural infection. And so you have this need to repaint the Golden Gate Bridge in immunity terms, and whether that's in taking a booster, and we learned that people stop doing that or do it less than taking their initial vaccination despite the benefits. And for the folks that never took a vaccine in the first place, virtually all of them have been infected by now, but then they're going to have to be reinfected in order to gain immunity as their immunity from their infection fades. So this is kind of my metaphor for where we are and where we're likely to be for the next several years. And what this translates into is surges and desurges and resurges. And hopefully we continue to see this relative disconnect between cases and hospitalizations. But the cases, as I'm sure you all are seeing, are really quite high now. All of us know people who've been infected in the last few weeks that had dodged it for 2 years. And I think that's just the nature of the life that we're going to be in for the foreseeable future. So those are sort of the baseline comments I want to make about COVID. Let me turn my attention to most of the talk to the digital transformation of healthcare and how COVID has accelerated in, I think, some interesting ways. I like this comment from my friend John Halamka. John left Harvard, where he was chief information officer, to go to the Mayo Clinic. And he joined the Mayo Clinic on January 1st, 2020. And as John told me when I interviewed him for a podcast, I was handed the 2030 digital transformation plan. Do you know that in 2020, by the end of the year, we finished the 2030 plan? COVID accelerated 10 years of transformation into 10 months. And I think for many of us, that has been an experience that we've had. There were certain things that we were simply forced to do, and our systems, which are not known for their nimbleness, became quite nimble because it was absolutely essential that they do so. And so there has been some major acceleration in transformation, some of which will stick. And probably the most visible one is the one Richard mentioned already. This is our video visits, and I'm sure you could look at curves at Davis and pretty much every other health system, and they look like this. I had been pushing very hard for telemedicine. I'm a big believer, and I managed in my department to get our telemedicine visits up from 1% to 2% over about 4 years, just to show you my level of authority and credibility. And within a month, that went from 2% to 55%. So COVID was better than I was in getting the adoption of this new technology. It ultimately peaked at 70%. In most places, it's down to about 20 to 25%. We're still a little bit higher than that in San Francisco, but massively ahead of where we would have been. And I'm guessing that if this curve had just progressed organically in the normal way, technologies and innovations enter the healthcare system, it would have taken 5 to 10 years to get up to 20 to 25% televisits. So that got accelerated into a few months. Very importantly, there were some key enablers, and the future of telemedicine really will depend on whether those enablers stay in place or not. Big one, obviously, was fear, as doctors didn't want to see patients in person, patients didn't want to come into healthcare systems in person. That was a big one, and is somewhat relaxed, although I still think there's some reluctance to do in-person contact. But very importantly, some relaxation of regulatory barriers and payment parity drove, or at least enabled, the acceptance and the growth in telemedicine. And the future will be determined by what happens with these payment and regulatory changes. And I would have said 6 months ago, now that everybody has tasted telemedicine, they're not going back. They know its virtues, doctors like it, patients like it. And sort of just like Uber, when it enters a community, you sort of get past the political resistance and people like it enough that they fight it if you try to take it away. This is one that's been a little surprising, as the majority of states now have re-erected some of their licensure barriers to telemedicine. So for example, during the height of the pandemic, someone with a California license could do a televisit for a patient in Nevada or Oregon, and that was fine. Those barriers have been re-erected. And so we, for example, at UCSF are no longer doing new televisits to out-of-state patients if we don't have a license in that state. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen with these regulatory and payment enablers and potentially barriers. But clearly, we're not going back to 2% telemedicine. So I think telemedicine is interesting, but it's important beyond just what it is. And to me, it's important potentially as a bridge toward a more virtualized healthcare system. And this is what I mean. If it's simply a visit replacement, if it's simply a different way of the patient coming in and seeing their primary care doctor for 15 minutes, that's fine. And it's more convenient for patients. Actually, most surveys show that patients like it better than in-person visits. Providers mostly seem to like it as well. And probably the biggest policy issue and issue about the healthcare system writ large is that it opens up new non-geographically determined care options. And what that means is, if, think about the Mayo Clinic 20 years ago, they wanted to have a presence outside of Minnesota. What they needed to do was build hospitals and clinics, brick and mortar, and they chose to do it for obvious reasons in Florida and Arizona. If they were doing it today, I'm not sure they would do that. I think they would say, we want to be a national brand, and we're going to work really hard on expanding our telemedicine presence first and foremost. And so hospitals and clinics that had sort of regional hegemony because they were the only game in town now may be competing against other entities that aren't located in their region, but patients may have options to see clinicians in those systems through virtual means. So potentially a pretty big deal there in terms of sort of shaking up the way the competitive landscape works. But by and large, if it's only a visit replacement, I don't think it's transformative. When it's potentially a game changer is if it is really one step along a path toward true virtual care. And so you can imagine how that might be facilitated. Patients no longer are coming into the office where they get their blood pressure and their weight and their glucose checked. It means you now are dependent on digital data streams. They're stepping on a digital scale. They're getting their blood pressure checked with a digital blood pressure meter. And now those data streams, which of course are no longer checking something once every 3 months, but checking something every day, let's say, or if it's glucose 4 times a day, those measures are going to come into healthcare systems essentially semi-continuously. And I think the trillion-dollar question in healthcare is going to be, as that happens more and more, and there's more data coming from your watch and your scale and your toilet and all these, everything that's wired, how does that interact with the healthcare system? Do companies spring up to manage that data? Do existing healthcare systems figure out how to manage that data? And let me show you kind of what this looks like and how hard it is. And periodically, by the way, I'll hear some people that talk about the future of healthcare, and they will say, how great is it going to be when all 1,500 or 2,000 patients that a primary care doctor follows can have, fancy watches, and every bit of data about their heart rate and their pulse and their stress level is streaming into the primary care doctor, who's going to say, thank you, that's so wonderful that I can monitor each of my patients now so much better than I used to be able to do that. Now, when I hear that, I have to tell you, my BS detector goes off wildly, because that is not a world that I'm familiar with. The world I'm familiar with is if I tell the 200 primary care doctors in my department that that is happening starting tomorrow, they will all quit by 5 o'clock this afternoon. There is no way that that kind of data flow can be supported in the existing chassis of our healthcare system. And in fact, it's already falling apart. When I ask our docs what their major source of dissatisfaction and burnout is, they always say it's my digital inbox, because I'm getting tons of queries and questions from patients that come to my electronic inbox because we've given them digital tools, but really haven't given them the digital means to answer the questions they need to have answered, or even do something as easy as schedule an appointment or get a medicine refill. So this does not work. So what has to happen? Well, what has to happen and has to be enabled is a new layer in the healthcare system that we don't currently have, that I and others have sometimes called care traffic controllers, analogous to air traffic controllers. And what do? Well, all right, they're monitoring 10,000 people out there in the real world who are all streaming in data of one kind or another. And here's one patient, 112, sugar is high. Again, the algorithm bumped the insulin, so there's maybe some AI involved in some basic algorithmic changes in care, but it's not working. Let's get the coach involved. So maybe not a doctor. Let's get another person in the system involved. And now we've got to kind of weave that all together. Patient 42, I see, has an irregular heart rate and a shorter breath. Let's do a televisit as soon as possible. And here in the world, this is a little getting out there a little bit, but maybe not too far-fetched. In a world of the Internet of Things, when everything in your house is wired and enabled, patient 13's weight is up and oxygen saturation is worse, I'll lock the salt shaker and the refrigerator. That may be a little bit far-fetched, but this is what we're going to need as more and more care is virtual. And I can tell you that existing legacy healthcare systems, including my own, are completely unprepared to deal with this. So some new part of the system is going to have to spring up to deal with the continuous or semi-continuous flow of digital data from patients. So that's kind of all I want to say about telemedicine and what it might mean in terms of virtual care. Let me take another thing that I think hit its tipping point in COVID, and I think this is pretty exciting, although not particularly sexy. And these are dashboards. So finally, we're taking all of the digital data that we've collected so painstakingly and is sloshing around through our digital tubes, and we're delivering usable real-time information in visually attractive and actionable form to managers and clinicians. So I think we have seen that the days of a doctor needing some information about a patient, or a manager or a leader or a policymaker, and somebody saying, oh, we have that, and sending them a spreadsheet is over. That it can't work. They get ignored. They're not usable. They're not actionable. And COVID accelerated that because it had to. So I show here what UCSF Health's COVID-19 Enterprise Dashboard looks like. This is from a couple of days ago. I'm on this every single day. And in a single glance, I can see how we're doing in COVID. If I look in the upper right, I can see the number of people in the hospital, in the ICU, If I want to see that divided by people who are vaccinated versus not vaccinated, I can see that by clicking on jump to vaccination status. If I want to see whether they're in the hospital because they have COVID or they have incidental COVID, I can jump to hospitalization category. On the bottom left, I see our overall case positivity rate divided by people who came in with COVID symptoms, 23% turn out positive, and really very importantly, asymptomatic positivity, meaning people who are coming in for gallbladder surgery or colonoscopy. We test all of them. 1 out of 20 of them are positive. So that's a lot of COVID in the air. These are people who have no symptoms of COVID whatsoever. The point is, this is data that exists digitally. In the old days, we would have sent out spreadsheets worthless. In the new days, we have people and tools to put it together in what I hope you'll agree is really a thoughtful way of presenting it, visually attractive, one-stop shopping. And I think as we've gotten used to this and gotten a little addicted to it, we now know this is what you can and you should do with your digital data. And we're going to see more and more of it for frontline clinicians as well as healthcare system policymakers as well as other policymakers. And so this takes 10 seconds a day if I want to go on and see United States cases versus certain other countries. Here's our world in data, easy to do. Here's a tool that was created by a bunch of digital folks living in a house together as roommates in San Francisco. And they said, we want to be able to figure out what your risk of given activities are. So you see here, you put in where you are and it knows the case rates in your community. You say what you're going to be doing. You say whether you're vaccinated, how many shots you've gotten, how close you're going to be, whether you're wearing a mask. And it then spits out how risky that is in terms of the risks per million encounters. This says 5 micro-COVID. So 1 out of a million, or I guess 5 out of a million. So 1 out of 200,000 chance you'll get COVID from this particular experience. Obviously, it needs to get updated for each variant. So, but just the idea that you can go online and take advantage of digital data to answer important questions is an important trend in healthcare that I think has been accelerated with COVID. Now, AI, of course, is what people think about first when they think about digital transformation, and also interoperability. When are all these systems going to connect to one another? So let me make a comment about them. There's a lot of AI in the world, a lot of companies jumping into this space. Many of them have said, oh, we figured out AI in retail or in travel or in financial services. We're going to do it in healthcare. As I always warn each of them, I advise a few of them, first of all, the idea of fail fast, invent stuff and fail fast is fine when you're inventing a restaurant app, not so good if you kill someone. So healthcare is different that way. It's also different because, as I tell folks, doctors are much better lobbyists than taxi cab drivers. So get ready to deal with a fair amount of pushback by all of the legacy entities, but a whole lot of venture capital coming in. While I might have anticipated that the pandemic would be AI's moment to shine, I can't identify a truly game-changing AI application, despite a lot of tries, national temperature checking through digital thermometers to pinpoint, an outbreak a day or two earlier than might have happened earlier. Otherwise, there's stuff that sounds pretty cool, but whether it's made a real difference, I think not so much. How about interoperability? This came out from the Pence task force early on in the pandemic. They were requesting all hospitals report the following information to the federal government. All COVID-19 testing that's not listed above be reported on the attached spreadsheet. So you were supposed to fill out a spreadsheet and either email it in or fax it into the federal government, just to show you the backwardness of our healthcare and federal public health systems. And so the pandemic exposed our lack of digital connectedness. During COVID, we still found ourselves faxing spreadsheets. And what we need to do, and we made a little progress here, but still there's a long way to go. I find my analogy here is that of the transcontinental railroad, where initially you had train tracks of different caliber. They connected in different places, so it was all pretty funky. And eventually they realized we need one set of train tracks of the same caliber that cuts across the country. Here they are connecting, I think, in Utah with the Golden Spike. And we need our Golden Spike in healthcare, not only to connect my Epic system to your Epic system or my Epic system to your Cerner system, but increasingly the data that comes from watches and Alexas and iPhones and genomic testing to enterprise systems such as Epic and Cerner. And if you think about the financial system, I can put my Bank of America card in a Citibank machine in Tokyo, and it knows who I am, and it spits out $100 or the equivalent number of yen. None of that exists in healthcare. So that's going to be a very important obstacle to overcome. And surprisingly, it moved forward a little bit during COVID, but not very much. So let me turn to a few comments about what I think the era that we're in healthcare technological transformation, which is what I call the post-electronic health record era. This is in the middle of this picture is a faculty member of mine named Russ Cucina, who is our chief health information officer. So he's in charge of all the healthcare computers, and particularly our Epic system. And it's a huge job, and he's very good at it. I hired Russ maybe about 15 years ago after he finished his informatics fellowship at Stanford. And I said, you're going to have a really exciting job. We're going to put in this big new system, hundreds of millions of dollars, change the way we do everything, this electronic health record. And you're going to be in charge of sort of making it work. It's going to be pretty cool. But then I said, I'm a little worried for you. What are you going to do after we've implemented our EHR? So to my mind, once that was done, we're kind of done with our digital transformation. That obviously, I'm not sure it's the stupidest thing I've ever said to a mentee, but it's certainly in the top 5 because we've now learned that the electronic health record is just foundational. It is the system of record. It's the system by which you collect a whole lot of data and store it. But on top of it, we're going to have to layer a whole bunch of other systems that do things the electronic health record simply cannot do for you. And there are a lot of companies, a lot of venture capital that have realized that although it's going to be hard to displace the big electronic health record vendors, there is still a huge amount of activity that needs to go on in digital health to allow the system to deliver the best, safest, cheapest, most accessible, most equitable care. And you see here the investment by venture capital in digital health going up from, in 2015, $5 billion a year to 2021, close to $30 billion a year. So Silicon Valley clearly believes that this is the future and is investing in a lot of companies. Some of this is probably frothy, and we're seeing some corrections now. But ultimately, they're investing because they see a system, healthcare system in the United States, that's 18% of the gross domestic product, a $4.5 trillion economy, and a system that by every measure doesn't work very well, and clearly can be made to work better if digital was a part of it in a way that we sorted out how to make that work for patients and for providers. So they are making a very big bet. So are the digital giants, and every big digital company in the world is making a big play in healthcare. And the first one really was Watson. After they beat the Jeopardy champions, they said, we're going to do this for healthcare. Google made a big play here, hiring Geisinger CEO David Feinberg to run a team in something called Google Health. Microsoft, a big play in healthcare. Apple, mostly with hardware and its watch and other associated tools. Probably the most interesting one was about, I guess, 2019. Only 3 years ago, Amazon, JP Morgan, Berkshire Hathaway, 3 companies with unlimited resources, decided to get into healthcare in a big way, called their thing Haven, hired the Harvard surgeon and writer Atul Gawande to run it. Felt like a can't miss enterprise. Just to show it, I've spoken to a lot of these companies, a lot of these leaders, and they all said the right things. They said, we know how hard this is. We've tried it before and we failed, but this time we're in it for the long haul. We're not in it to replace doctors or replace hospitals. We want to be adjuncts and supportive. They said all the right things. And yet each of them is struggling. And just to show how hard it is, Haven is closed. IBM sold off Watson, and mostly for parts. David Feinberg left Google, and Google Health no longer exists as a standalone entity. Apple is struggling to figure out how to move forward with its healthcare products. Microsoft's still doing okay, mainly because they're mostly selling to businesses rather than consumers. So this just shows a lot of interest in the area, but still not for the faint of heart, still pretty tough to get it right. So despite that, why am I enthusiastic about healthcare entering its post-electronic health record phase? In part because if you think about who won the derby to build the electronic health records, 2 main companies for big healthcare systems were 2 of these companies called Epic and Cerner. They were built to do this. Their job was the only thing they did as a product was to build an electronic health record. And that was not for lack of trying. Google tried, Microsoft tried, GE, our original electronic health record at UCSF was built by GE. Some of the great technology companies in the world, they all failed. It turned out to build an EHR, you needed to have this be your only focus. It's really complicated. You need to understand the work. You needed to be focused on healthcare specifically. And so these companies were around when healthcare finally went digital over the last 10 years, and they did quite well. But if you think about what we were buying when we bought Epic, we were buying a enterprise tool that mostly collected clinical data and billing data, kind of moved it around in relatively simple ways, and allowed us to record what we were doing with patients, to send a bill to Aetna or Medicare, to write a simple prescription and get it to Walgreens. But they were not expert in all of the things we need our digital tools in healthcare to do for us today. Be consumer facing. There are more people at UCSF on our patient portal than doctors using our system. So it's now become a hugely consumer facing tool. Building beautiful user interfaces. That's clearly not true when you go onto the electronic health record. Some of the data visualization I showed you before for our dashboards were not core competencies of the electronic health record vendors. Learning from data, communications, AI, none of these were core competencies of the electronic health record tools. So I think we're entering the EHR, post-EHR era, facilitated by the pressures on healthcare systems to do better, more interoperability, although not perfect. I think COVID is going to accelerate this because of labor shortages. Even if you had unlimited money and said, all right, we're going to solve this problem of patients trying to get into our system with more navigators or more, we need more nurses. You just can't find enough people anymore. And so healthcare enterprises are realizing that the labor shortages mean that you're going to have to digitize and make your processes more efficient. You can't even solve it, even if you have enough money, because of the labor shortages. I've already mentioned the overwhelming problem of the inbox. Some of the solution to that is going to have to be more thoughtful digital systems. The improvements in the technology of AI, and digital companies are maturing. They kind of now, when I look at new startups, they are better at this. They understand how different this is than financial tech, for example. So do the giants, even though they're struggling. And I think we've all seen the limitations of electronic health records can offer. We're not getting rid of them anytime soon, but we've seen that we can't depend on them to do all the things we need to have done digitally. And I think healthcare organizations are going to have to remake themselves to thrive in this era. So let me show you kind of what we've done at UCSF, which I think is important. You may not, if you're in a healthcare system, you may not organize yourself precisely this way, but the general principle that the way you organized yourself when your main work was putting in and running electronic health record, and the way you're going to have to organize yourself when the main work is not that, is going to be very, very important. You have to give this a lot of thought. So at UCSF, for the last 15 or 20 years, we have a fairly traditional digital arm that faculty member I showed you earlier runs. We call it the Medical Informatics or Health Informatics Group. It's there to solve core clinical and business problems, mostly on a relatively short time horizon. Here's something we need to make better over the next 6 months. And it tends to focus its energy on the electronic health record and related tools. And they're so busy just doing that and then making sure we don't get hacked and putting in our tool, our electronic health record, in a new partner community hospital. They are pretty overwhelmed just doing that. We have another entity, the Center for Digital Health Innovation, and I call it our digital solution shop. Its job is different than the traditional arm. They're there to solve big, hairy problems over a longer time horizon, like let's solve this over the next 3 to 5 years. There are often problems that do not have a simple or single solution. You're not going to find, it's not going to be Epic does it for you. It's not going to be that some startup has created this solution that's perfect. It's going to be, you're going to spend a year really deeply understanding the problem, the nature of the problem, the perspective of all of the players, including patients and providers and administrators. And you're then going to come up with a solution that may very well be weaving together some things that a third-party startup tool can do, something Epic can do, something we have to build ourselves. It's all going to have to then be woven together and ultimately integrated into our Epic system. Because from the standpoint of an end user, they can't be logging off Epic, where they're spending their entire life, and into a completely separate system. So it has to be accessible in a seamless way from the core enterprise system. So the big problem that this group is focusing on now is what we call the digital patient experience. And you see the tagline, the right patient, provider, time, modality. Every healthcare system has a version of this that they're trying to solve. But it's quite clear to me that if we didn't have this Center for Digital Health Innovation focusing on this, expecting the digital enterprise that was built to put in and run Epic or whatever your electronic health record is not going to work. And in addition, the CDHI, they spend a lot of their time looking at Silicon Valley, looking at startups, looking to see who's building tools that might be useful in a way, again, your day-to-day enterprise IT people just are not doing. That's not their worldview. So whether you organize it with two separate entities or two different parts of a single entity, that's going to be inside baseball. But I think very important for us to be thinking about our own organizational framework for a world that no longer is utterly dependent on the electronic health record as its main or only digital tool. So let me move to the end. I want to be sure we have plenty of time for discussion and questions. Let me make several predictions that I think are pretty easy, and then I'll give you one hard one. Here are the easy ones. Health IT will ultimately transform and disrupt health and healthcare. And if you think about it, industries that have not been utterly transformed by digitization, I would say healthcare and education are the only two I can think of. Financial services, travel, the way you do your taxes, the way you book a vacation, the way you do transportation, the way you buy things, the way you get your entertainment. Every single one of them has been turned upside down by a digital transformation. In many cases, the leading entities after that transformation didn't exist at the beginning, and the leading entities at the beginning are no longer in business. We certainly have not seen that kind of transformation in healthcare, but I believe we will. And the timeline for that has been shortened materially by COVID. Still not going to happen next year, but how long it would have taken, it's certainly going to take less time than it would have taken had it not been for the pandemic. I believe our new healthcare system will be less institution focused, less geographically determined, more patient centric, and deliver higher quality, less expensive, and more equitable care. In other words, I think it'll be better. The winners in that derby will be any one of these four parties. And I do believe that, working at UCSF or UC Davis, we are clearly legacy providers. And if you thought about that, you would say, look what happened to Kodak, look what happened to Blockbuster. That's not a good position to be in. And that might be right. So I think existing healthcare organizations that thoughtfully and aggressively embrace transformation, there will be winners, although there'll be some losers. And I don't think AI is delivering your baby or doing your surgery anytime soon. So there's clearly going to need to be brick and mortar healthcare providers, even if some of what we currently do will be done in very, very different ways, particularly a lot of ambulatory and home care. I think the electronic health record vendors like Epic and Cerner are not going to go away, but they're going to need to innovate and figure out ways of opening up their architecture in a way that they've mostly fought for now because they have not seen a business case to build something as seamless as the App Store. I think the digital giants that are able to maintain a focus on health, there will be winners there, although I give that a lower probability over the last couple of years as I've seen the struggles of the Googles and the Amazons in this arena. Obviously, they have unlimited money and they have unlimited talent and they have unlimited technology, but healthcare is hard and it's harder than they think. And every time they get into it, there's a little bit of an instinct to, why are we bothering with this? It's not our core business. Let's focus on selling goods or doing better search. And they're going to have to get past that if they want to be major players in healthcare. I think a lot of the winners will come from new companies and startups that skillfully address important use cases, although obviously a lot of these startups will fail. I think those are all easy predictions. I actually, would go to the bank on all of them. I'm quite confident that all of these will turn out to be true. The hard thing to predict is when. I do not know whether this is 5 years, it's not 2 years away, whether it's 5 years away or 15. I don't think it's more than that as we look to a transformed healthcare system. So let me end with this quote from either Yogi Berra said it or he should have a lot of Yogi Berra quotes that were attributed to him, but he may not have never said this. But I particularly like this one, and I think it's apt as we think about digital transformation and the future of healthcare. Yogi either said or might have said, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. And so this is harder than it looks, but it's an interesting and very important journey as we go on and try to figure out the future of our healthcare system and how to make it better and safer and less expensive. So with that, let me stop. I will stop sharing my slides and look forward to hearing your questions and comments.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wachter, for just a fantastic talk today. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pause so that Bert can go ahead and stop the recording.